Hello, welcome back to the channel, and indeed welcome to this glorious February morning. There is not a single cloud in the sky. It is absolutely beautiful. A little over 12 months ago, I made a video entitled My Polytunnel Regrets, and if you've not seen it, I will actually link it down below in the description for you, where I discussed all the things that I would do differently had I had the opportunity to buy the polytunnel all over again. But it was quite a knee-jerk reaction video. I'd only had it for 8 weeks at the time. I had yet to grow anything in it, much less grow a whole year's worth of food. So I thought that it was time to revisit that subject, especially some of you may be considering buying a polytunnel for this growing season. So do I still regret it? Are there things that I would change? You'll have to wait and see. But let's start with the polytunnel tour. I thought maybe I should start with a bit of stats for you. We bought this polytunnel from First Tunnels. It is a 20 foot by 12 foot polytunnel, and it cost us about £1,200. They do some offers, so the more you buy, the better the discount that you get. And in fact, I think we paid £1,400 in total for the polytunnel and the 4 metre squared fruit cage. Now, we are not the best at DIY here, but we managed quite easily to build this polytunnel ourselves, and I really enjoyed the process, to be honest, to feel that invested in what you're building and to know ins and outs of how it works as well. The instructions that come with it are really, really good. If you're someone like me that likes to visually see how to do something as opposed to just reading an instruction, there's like these QR codes and links so that you can watch little videos on each step along the way to help you build it. This is the second time that I have tried to grow crops over winter in here, and I have to say I'm really impressed with it. Everything does seem to be doing quite well here in the moment. I've got some spring onions on the end. These are my winter density lettuces, moving down to all of the purple sprouting broccoli that I have, which are intersown with a few little gem lettuces as well. They're looking very, very healthy, aren't they? I'm very, very pleased with them. At the far end of the polytunnel, I do have quite a few oriental mustards that are really just starting to take off now. I'm really quite thrilled with how they are looking. There's quite a breeze coming through the door at the moment. I have a couple of tubs here of early carrots. Hopefully they will start to grow on and produce a crop of carrots. A few more mustards on the other side of the door. Got some more lettuces and spring onions intersown there. Next along I have a row of these Savoy cabbages. They're looking pretty good too so far. Beyond those Savoy cabbages, we've got more winter density lettuces, and there's a few very sad looking little gems that have been left languishing in the greenhouse. I've just planted them up in here this morning. They were very dry actually, so hopefully they'll pick up, but if not, I have sown some more. Red salad bowl lettuce, more spring onions, more winter density, more sad little gems I've just planted in here. Got a few more mustards, and then we have my curly red kale right at the end that I transplanted into here. The centre aisle is filled with cauliflowers and cabbages, and as you can see, they're all looking really, really good as well, growing nicely, with some rocket right at the end. I'm really happy with how these crops are looking. I think they look super healthy, and I'm really pleased that I have this undercover growing space to be growing all year round. But you might be thinking, these are cold loving crops anyway, Claire. You don't need to be growing these in the polytunnel. They would all grow outside quite happily over winter. And in theory, you might be right, but I actually have a direct comparison for you. That centre bed full of the cauliflowers and the cabbages, I planted at the same time cauliflowers and cabbages outside as well. So let's see how they're doing by comparison. They were sown at the same time, the same seed grown in the same seed cells. Some went in the polytunnel, some went outside. But they don't look anywhere near as good as the ones in the polytunnel, do they? Let's have a closer look. You can see that they haven't grown anywhere near as much. There's quite a bit more slug pressure out here, and some of them are looking, well, pretty poor by comparison. If you look at this one especially here, not really grown much at all, quite a few dead leaves on it. And the same here with this one, which I'm assuming has not been enjoying the cold and the wet weather. Now these ones here in this bed were actually planted a bit after these ones, and these have really not fared well at all. Again, the same seedlings, I just left them in the greenhouse a bit longer because I still had crops growing in this bed. Because if I show you inside here, I think you can see that these ones are looking really, really poor by comparison. And especially at this end, these are the spare purple sprouting broccoli that I currently have growing in the polytunnel. Exactly the same ones from the same seed cells. And well, they are not doing well at all, are they? So obviously moving back inside the polytunnel again, it is fair to see that these crops here do have an advantage being grown under cover over winter. Now obviously it does still get cold in here overnight. Polythene is not going to provide much heat insulation for the crops. Minus 4.8 in here actually last night. Currently about 15 degrees, but it did reach a high of 18 before I opened the doors fully this morning. But what it does do is protect them from the incessant wind, rain, the snow landing on them that you get with the crops that are outside. And obviously that is what has caused the problems with them out there. Now I'm not saying that they won't produce for me outside. They probably will produce come spring when the weather has picked up, but I'm definitely going to be getting an earlier crop to help me through the hungry gap by having undercover growing space. Now, one of the biggest concerns that I had with this polytunnel was how we were going to support our crops in here over summer. I was absolutely convinced that I wasn't going to be able to make it work by tying into these poles because it's skinned so tightly. And I was thinking that this pole was sort of towards the front edge of the bed and the crops needed to be further back. And I had all this idea of how I was going to have to build some structure to make it work. But actually, I was overreacting. I had no problems whatsoever in tying crops in here. I used paracord, tied straight up to the bar, didn't cause any damage to the polythene whatsoever, and I'll be using that system again. We also position this polytunnel east to west, which means that we get a south side and a north side of the polytunnel. And we have it facing in the prevailing wind, which means that we get a really nice breeze blowing through these doors all year round. And that's vital in summer. You need that airflow to help protect against blight, but it's equally important now in winter because we're finding that it's not overly damp in here. The airflow does help clear the condensation and keep fungus gnats to a minimum. When we spec'd the polytunnel, we chose to have the upgraded hoops, so these are 35mm instead of 25mm. We had all of the additional storm bracing that you could buy, and I have to say I'm really pleased that the polytunnel has stood up to everything that the weather has thrown at it. We've had quite a lot of really severe storms since we've had this polytunnel put in, and it hasn't moved an inch. It has been absolutely rock solid. Famous last word, so I better touch a bit of wood. Now, one of my biggest concerns when I was ordering the polytunnel was its vulnerability. At the end of the day, this is just a sheet of plastic. It won't stand up too much. But I've had absolutely no damage caused to this polytunnel in this first 15 months. Again, tempting fate, so I better touch wood. And maintenance-wise, it has been pretty low-key. All I've had to do is clean the polytunnel inside and out once since I've had it, and I'm good to go for another season. So low maintenance and stronger than you think, I have to say. Now, obviously, that's not to say that they won't get damaged. If you follow JB, then you'll see that his polytunnel was damaged by foxes. So you may have to think about that if you do have those pests around, but I haven't had any trouble with mine. And at the end of the day, as much as it would be an inconvenience, a new sheet for this is about £120. So if I had to, recovering it isn't actually overly expensive. Now, that's not to say that we didn't have a few issues with the polytunnel over our first growing season, and the main one there was the lack of shade that we had on this south side. The tomatoes were really struggling late spring, early summer, and I did have to put some shade netting up. As soon as I put the shade netting up, the tomatoes did pick up, but it is something that I will bear in mind in future years. And in fact, we do have a few plans for the garden, which will include adding a little bit of natural shade outside to this side of the polytunnel. I was so consumed with the feeling that it needed to have the maximum light, the maximum sun, that we purposely chose a spot that had no shade. But actually, that's probably one thing that I don't regret, but it was a little bit of a mistake. Now, to be honest, it was only a problem with the tomatoes. The cucumbers, the melons and the loofahs absolutely loved the sun that they got in here. So I might actually try and swap them around this year or mix them up a little bit and just see if there's a side of the polytunnel that crops prefer better. But it is something to bear in mind. Don't go chasing maximum sun. These get hot enough anyway. The sun's high in the sky. It comes through the roof as it is. So a bit of natural shade won't go amiss. Now, I intentionally chose not to have any staging in here. My intention was only ever to grow in the ground in here. A few people questioned that decision, but I don't regret it one bit. It worked fine for me. I have 2 greenhouses anyway, so I have plenty of staging in those to start off the seedlings. So whilst I don't regret not having staging in here, one of the things that we did add to the polytunnel last year was this floating shelf, and I would strongly recommend you consider making one for your polytunnel. Now, it's stowed away here at the top of the polytunnel at the moment because we don't need to use it right now, and I did time my tomatoes up to it in summer. But in spring, when you've got your summer squashes and your pumpkins and all things that you're waiting to get planted out, lots and lots of peas and things in here, before your tomatoes start to get really going, it was absolutely great to have that extra space when things are in big pots. I think I'd regret not having one if I hadn't put one in by now. Now this corner is probably the only thing that I changed from the initial design of the polytunnel. Originally the beds went to the end on both sides and this desk was sat at the end of the centre bed. But I very quickly realised that I wanted to be able to open the doors in summer and see all of the crops in there, not be shielded by the desk. And it just gave me more space to be able to just sit here and look around the polytunnel. So if you're building one, I strongly recommend that you leave space for you to have somewhere to sit in the tunnel. It doesn't matter if you've got another potting shed or something somewhere else. Sitting in the polytunnel in the depths of winter is absolutely priceless. 18 degrees in here today. It's like a spring day. It feels absolutely wonderful and it's so good for the soul, especially if you're someone that suffers with something like a seasonal affective disorder. Another thing that I was unsure about was whether I really wanted this centre bed layout in the polytunnel, and I have to say it has worked amazingly for me. Everything was so easy to get at and access to harvest, and it really helped with airflow through the plants as well. So I don't regret that. Obviously you can lay out your polytunnel how you wish, but this layout has really worked for me. Now, one of the main advantages of a polytunnel is their price compared to a greenhouse over the same footprint. Pounds per foot, the polytunnel is significantly cheaper. Now, when I was in the process of purchasing the polytunnel, I have to say it took me quite a few weeks and a lot of deliberation to click on that checkout button. I kept thinking, do I even need a polytunnel? Plenty of people grow tomatoes and cucumbers outside all year round and they don't have any undercover growing space. And it just kept weighing on my mind whether it was an expense that I really needed to be making. I have to say though, after the first summer, all of those fears faded away. It was more than worth buying it. The return on the crops inside to ones that were growing outside was just incomparable. The tomatoes in here kept fruiting right through until autumn. I had no blight problems in here whatsoever. They were very, very healthy plants. By comparison, the ones that were growing outside never really got going, never reached their full potential, and I only got a handful of tomatoes off them. So had I only been growing tomatoes outside, I'd have had a very disappointing yield last year. I also doubt that I'd have been able to grow the melons and the loofahs that I grew in here last year, and they brought so much joy. So for that alone, the polytunnel was more than worth it. So I guess the question to answer is, after owning it for over a year, is do I regret anything about the polytunnel? And unfortunately, the answer is still yes. I do still have some polytunnel regrets, but they're the same ones that I had when I only had it for 2 months. And that is, I wish I'd gone bigger. I still wish that I'd gone 25 foot by 14 foot. And that decision is even more of a regret now because I've grown in it for 12 months and realised just how wonderful it is having this space. So if you're sitting on that fence of indecisiveness like I was back in July of 2023, then my advice is don't delay. You won't regret it, I promise you. You buy that polytunnel and you enjoy growing this season.